The first thing every woman in Dusty Creek told Wilhelmina Dalton when she stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a battered leather trunk and a heart full of stubborn hope was to stay as far away from Jacob Bristol as God and good sense would allow. Wilhelmina had arrived in Dusty Creek, Colorado Territory, in the spring of 1878, when the town was still raw enough that the lumber of its buildings smelled like fresh-cut pine, and the main street turned into a river of red mud every time the clouds opened up. She had come from Kansas City, where her father had died leaving behind nothing but debt and a reputation for poor decisions, and she had taken a position as the new school teacher because it was the only respectable employment that had answered her letters. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that refused to stay pinned, and eyes the color of good river water, a shade somewhere between green and gray that changed depending on the sky. She was not fragile, though she looked it at first glance. She had that quality of still water that ran deep, the kind of person who took longer than most to speak, but who, once she had decided something, held to it like iron. The stagecoach depot was little more than a covered platform with a hitching post and a hand-painted sign, and she had barely set her trunk down before Mrs. Eugenia Hartwell, the postmistress, and apparently the self-appointed welcoming committee of Dusty Creek, had taken her firmly by the elbow and steered her toward the general store with the urgency of someone conducting a fire drill. "You will meet everyone worth meeting today," Eugenia had said, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman who had outlasted 3 droughts and 2 husbands, "and some you would do well never to meet at all. The most important thing I can tell you, Miss Dalton, is this: you see a man riding a black horse, tall in the saddle, dark hat, answers to Bristol. You cross to the other side of the street." Wilhelmina had nodded politely while taking in the town around her, noting the blacksmith, the saloon, the small whitewashed church, and a building that would be her schoolhouse judging by the bell above its door. "What has he done?" she had asked reasonably. Eugenia had made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a shudder. "It is not what he has done so much as what he is. He is trouble, Miss Dalton, the kind of trouble that does not announce itself. Clara Beaumont nearly ran off with him 2 years ago, and she said afterward he had made her promises he never intended to keep. Roberta Finch's younger sister swore he broke her heart clean in 2. And there are the other things, the men he rides with, the business he keeps, none of it fit for polite company." Several more women had offered variations of the same warning over the following days. The sheriff's wife, Mrs. Aldridge, had said he was dangerous. The woman who ran the laundry had called him a wolf in handsome clothing. The pastor's wife had pressed Wilhelmina's hand and said she would pray for anyone foolish enough to fall for Jacob Bristol's particular brand of charm. By the end of her first week in Dusty Creek, Wilhelmina had constructed a fairly vivid portrait of this man from other people's words alone: a liar, a drifter, a heartbreaker, possibly a criminal, almost certainly not to be trusted under any circumstance. She had filed this information away carefully and set about the business of making herself a life in Dusty Creek. She had a classroom to arrange, 22 children to prepare for, and no time whatsoever for trouble. It was on a Thursday morning in late April, 3 weeks after her arrival, that she first laid eyes on Jacob Bristol. She was carrying a crate of primer books from the general store to the schoolhouse, and she was managing just fine, thank you, despite the fact that the crate was heavy enough to make her arms ache. The spring sun was warm on her shoulders, and the main street was busy with morning commerce, and she was paying close attention to where she put her feet because the boards on the sidewalk had a tendency to shift. She did not see the man stepping out of the telegraph office until she had walked directly into him, and the crate of primer books went sideways, and half of them tumbled into the mud of the street below the boardwalk's edge. She heard a sharp, quiet expletive not directed at her, but at the situation, and then large hands were catching the remaining books before they followed the others, and she was steadying herself against the wall and looking up into the face of Jacob Bristol. She knew it was him immediately, not from any one feature but from the sum of all of them. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean and broad-shouldered in equal measure, with the kind of face that had seen weather, sun-darkened skin, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mountains visible to the west, dark eyes that were more complicated than they appeared at first glance. He wore a plain dark hat, dust-colored clothes that were clean despite the dust, and there was a gun at his hip, but that was true of half the men in this town. What struck her most was that he did not look like any of the things she had been told. He looked, in that first unguarded moment, like a man who was tired. Not the tired of a long day's work, but the tired that settles into a person's bones over years. "I am sorry," he said immediately, and his voice was lower than she expected and entirely genuine. "That was my fault. I came out too fast. Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was not entirely true since her heart was doing something inconvenient. The books, however. He was already down off the boardwalk and into the mud, collecting the primers with the unself-conscious practicality of a man who had no concern for whether mud got on his clothes. He gathered them up efficiently, wiped the worst of it off with the side of his hand and passed them back up to her. "They will dry," he said. "Mud does not ruin a book permanently." "No," she agreed, "it does not." He picked up her crate as though it weighed nothing and held it out to her. Their hands briefly overlapped on the wood handle, just long enough for her to feel that his were rough and warm, and then she had the crate and he had stepped back and settled his hat. "You are the new school teacher," he said. It was not a question. "Wilhelmina Dalton," she confirmed because it seemed the right thing to say. He studied her for just a moment, the way a person looks at something they are trying to decide about. "Jacob Bristol," he said, and something shifted very slightly in his expression as though he expected the name to mean something to her, and he was braced for what that meaning would produce. She met his eyes steadily. "Thank you for retrieving the books, Mr. Bristol." A pause, something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. "Good morning, Miss Dalton." He touched the brim of his hat and walked away, and she stood there with her crate of primer books and watched him go, and tried very hard to locate within herself the alarm that every woman in Dusty Creek had told her she should feel. She found, instead, a very specific curiosity that she was not sure what to do with. She asked around carefully, because she was not a reckless woman, and what she found was a story told in fragments and second-hand accounts that did not quite stitch together into the monster she had been promised. Jacob Bristol ran a small ranch about 4 miles outside of town, a working cattle operation that he had built largely from nothing after arriving in the territory 6 years prior. He employed 3 men, all of whom spoke of him with a loyalty she could not entirely attribute to wages alone. He came to town for supplies, for mail, occasionally to sell cattle, and he kept very much to himself. He had a reputation for being hard to read and harder to warm up to, and those 2 qualities alone seemed to account for a significant portion of his bad name. The stories about Clara Beaumont and Roberta Finch's sister were harder to parse. When she spoke to Clara herself, a pretty, rather fluttery woman who worked in the millinery shop, the story she heard was not precisely what Eugenia had described. Clara had pursued Jacob Bristol with considerable determination, and he had been kind about declining her attentions, and Clara's wounded pride had transformed his polite withdrawal into a tale of broken promises over the telling. Roberta Finch's sister, she later discovered, had never actually spoken to Jacob Bristol in any substantive way. She had admired him from across the street and declared herself heartbroken when he rode out of town without glancing at her. None of this was criminal. None of it was even particularly unkind. What it was, Wilhelmina thought, was a portrait painted entirely by people who had been disappointed by their own expectations. She did not seek him out. That was not her way. But Dusty Creek was not a large town, and in the ordinary course of a week there were only so many places a person went, and Jacob Bristol came to town regularly enough that their paths crossed with what began to feel like something more than coincidence. The second time, he held the door of the general store open for her and asked how the primer books had survived their adventure in the mud. She told him they had dried out reasonably well, but one of them had a warped spine. He seemed genuinely amused by this. The third time, she was sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse in the late afternoon grading papers, taking advantage of the last good light, and he rode past slowly on his black horse, an animal that was clearly exceptional, with a elongated step and an unusual stillness for a horse of that size. He saw her and slowed without stopping, and lifted his hand in a brief acknowledgement, and she lifted hers back. The fourth time was the one that mattered. It was the first week of May, and there had been trouble at the Hendricks Ranch to the north. A fence dispute that had been simmering for months had finally boiled over into something uglier, and 2 men had been shot, neither fatally but badly enough to require Dr. Oakes to ride out for 2 days. The town was edgy in the way that small towns get when violence is near enough to touch, and the children at the schoolhouse had absorbed their parents' anxiety and translated it into restlessness and misbehavior. And by the time the afternoon bell rang, Wilhelmina had a headache that sat directly behind her eyes. She walked out to find that a group of older boys had cornered a younger child, Thomas Reyes, who was 8 years old and whose family had come up from New Mexico and who was, for reasons that made Wilhelmina's blood slow and cold with anger, treated by certain elements of the town as lesser than the other children. 3 boys of 12 or 13 had him backed against the fence of the schoolyard and were saying things in low, cruel voices. And Thomas was very still in the way that children become when they have learned that keeping still is the only armor they have. Wilhelmina crossed the yard with such decisive velocity that the 3 older boys scattered before she even spoke, but Thomas was trembling slightly, and his eyes were bright with the tears he was refusing to shed. She crouched down in the dust to his level and spoke to him quietly, and gave him her handkerchief, and walked him herself to the edge of the road where his older sister was waiting. She was still in the schoolyard when Jacob Bristol appeared at the gate. He had apparently been passing, or perhaps he had stopped when he saw what was happening from the road. He was standing at the fence with his hat in his hands, and his expression was careful. "Is the boy all right?" he asked. "He will be," she said. No thanks to, she stopped herself because it was not appropriate to say what she wanted to say about the parents who had clearly taught their children such things. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Reyes family. I know Miguel Reyes. He is a good man. He runs horses better than anyone I have ever seen. His son should be able to come to school without—" She stopped again. She pressed her fingers to the spot between her eyes where the headache lived. "Yes," Jacob said simply, "he should." There was something in the way he said it without qualification, without the "but that is how things are" that she had heard from other people when she had tried to discuss Thomas Reyes' situation, that made her look at him properly. He held her gaze without flinching. "It is an ugly thing," he said, "and it should not be. I know that does not fix anything." "No," she said, "but it is more than most people will say." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked as though he wanted to say something else, and was deciding whether to say it or not. In the end he said, "I do not know if you have anyone to bring you supper when you are working late, Miss Dalton, but the cook at the Lucky Bell does a decent chicken pie on Fridays, in case that is useful information." She looked at him. The late sun was behind him and she had to shade her eyes. "Is that an invitation, Mr. Bristol?" Something in his face shifted, not quite surprise, but close to it. "I think it might be," he said, as though he himself was discovering this in real time. "Friday, then," she said, and felt the decision settle into her with the solidity of something entirely right. He was already at the gate when she called after him, "Mr. Bristol, the women in this town have said a great many things to me about you." He paused but did not turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was prepared for something, though she could not tell precisely what. "I am aware of what they say," he said. "I have been paying attention," she told him, "to the difference between what people say and what I have seen." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face that had been held carefully closed for a very long time shifted, just slightly, like a door unlocking rather than opening. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. Then he rode away, and Wilhelmina stood in the dust of the schoolyard and acknowledged to herself that she was in a considerable amount of trouble of an entirely different kind than the women of Dusty Creek had warned her about. She spent Thursday in a state of controlled agitation that she refused to name. She rearranged her classroom twice for no reason. She corrected spelling tests with unusual meticulousness. She told herself she was simply being sensible and social, and that any civilized person accepted a dinner invitation when it was offered in good faith. She told herself this many times, until it stopped being necessary. She wore her better dress on Friday, not her best, because that would be obvious, but the dark blue wool with the fitted sleeves that her mother had helped her make the year before her mother died. She pinned her hair more carefully than usual. She permitted herself exactly this much vanity and no more. He was waiting outside the Lucky Bell Saloon and dining room at 6 in the evening, and he had cleaned up with the same unpretentious thoroughness that he seemed to apply to everything: a fresh shirt, his jaw shaved clean, his hair still damp at the edges. He had a quality of stillness that she found she did not want to disturb. He made her think of deep water, calm at the surface, with everything complicated happening underneath. The Lucky Bell was run by a woman named Frances Dumont, who had come west from Louisiana 20 years ago, and who made chicken pie that was, Wilhelmina had to admit, extraordinary. They were given a corner table, and Frances gave Wilhelmina a look of such calculated interest that Wilhelmina nearly laughed out loud. They ate and they talked, and it was the most interesting conversation she had had in the 3 years since her father's decline had narrowed her world to caretaking and debt management. Jacob Bristol was not the talker she might have expected from someone with a reputation for charm, but what he said was always worth hearing. He had come to Colorado Territory from Virginia originally. She had not expected that, the faint shadow of something soft and southern still present in his vowels when he was not guarding against it. He had come west after the war had ended, because there had been nothing in Virginia that he could go back to. He did not elaborate on this, and she did not press him. She understood that kind of grief, the kind that swallows a whole world and leaves a person starting over entirely from bare ground. He had worked cattle drives for 3 years before he had saved enough to take the land he had, land that had been considered too remote and too difficult for anyone to want it, which had made it affordable. He had spent 4 years building it into something. He spoke about the ranch with the particular care of a person describing something they have made with their own hands out of nothing. She told him about Kansas City, about her father's shop, about the teaching certificate she had worked for through 2 years of a normal school while also keeping house and caring for her father. She told him about the way the debt had arrived like water through a cracked foundation, slow at first and then everywhere at once, and the strange freedom of starting somewhere new even when the circumstances of that starting were not what she would have chosen. He listened the way he seemed to do everything with complete attention, as though whatever she was saying was the most important thing currently happening in the world. "You are not at all what I expected," she said, somewhere in the middle of the second helping of chicken pie, and then wished she had been less direct about it. But he did not seem offended. He seemed, if anything, slightly amused. "What did you expect?" "I had been given a rather comprehensive description before I met you," she said carefully. "I know what they say," he said again, but this time there was less of the prepared quality to it, more of the weariness she had seen in his face that first morning. "Most of it comes from the fact that I am not easy to read, I think. People fill in what they cannot see with whatever story makes sense to them. That is very generous of you toward people who have not been generous toward you." He looked at her, and the quality of that look was like something being carefully handed to a person who might handle it well. I have found that being angry about it does not change anything, Miss Dalton. It just makes the carrying heavier. She thought about that for a very long time after she went home that night, lying in the small room she rented from Mrs. Aldridge, the sheriff's wife who had warned her about this man, and staring at the ceiling while the night sounds of Dusty Creek settled around her. She thought about a man who had come from a ruined place and built something real with his hands and carried his wounds without bitterness. And she thought about all the words that had been laid over him like a false skin, until the words had become what people saw instead of the man himself. She thought, as sleep finally came, that the women of Dusty Creek had been very wrong indeed. Though she was not quite ready to say that to anyone yet, including herself, the days that followed moved with the quality of spring itself, something opening, slowly and then faster, with a brightness that was almost sharp. Jacob came to town more often, or perhaps she simply noticed when he came now. They had fallen into a pattern that was not quite courtship, not quite friendship, but something hovering between the two with considerable warmth. He helped her one Saturday morning, when she was struggling to repair one of the schoolhouse windows that had cracked in a late frost. He arrived with tools she had not asked for and fixed the window and 3 other things that had been wrong with the building for what appeared to be months, all without making a production of it. She made coffee on the small iron stove in the back of the classroom, and they sat on the schoolhouse steps and drank it while the morning warmed around them. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, because she had found that when he talked about the land he became more himself, more open, as though the land itself was the language he was most comfortable in. He told her about the layout of it, the main house that he had mostly built himself with help from his hands, the hay barn, the horses he was beginning to breed alongside the cattle, because horses were where the real future of the territory was going, he believed, with the railroad coming through and the towns growing. He told her about the creek that ran through the northwest corner of the property, cold even in summer, and the stand of aspen trees there that went gold in the fall with such completeness that a man could stand among them and believe the whole world had changed color. "I should very much like to see that," she said, without thinking too carefully about what that implied, and then felt color come into her face. He looked at her with that slight, complicated quality that was the closest he came to open expression. "I hope you will," he said, and let it rest there without pressing it, and she was grateful for his restraint and strangely moved by it at the same time. The trouble she had not been looking for arrived in the 3rd week of May in the form of a man named Garrett Holloway, who rode into Dusty Creek with 3 associates and took rooms at the Frontier Hotel on the east end of the main street. Garrett Holloway was a cattle broker by his own description, a man with wide shoulders and a wide smile and eyes that moved around a room the way a hawk's eyes move, always taking inventory, never entirely at rest. He was approximately 35, well-dressed by the standards of the territory, and he had a quality of surface charm that Wilhelmina recognized immediately, because it was the precise opposite of Jacob's quality of guarded sincerity. Holloway's charm announced itself. Jacob's revealed itself slowly, like fire from a flint. Holloway made it his immediate business to be agreeable to everyone of any standing in Dusty Creek, and within 2 days, he had been to dinner at 3 different homes and was known to everyone. He noticed Wilhelmina at a church social, and introduced himself with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before, and she was polite to him, and told him she was glad he was finding Dusty Creek agreeable, and moved away from him with the same instinct she would have used to back away from a horse that looked placid but whose ears were doing something uneasy. What she did not know then, and learned piece by piece over the next week, was that Garrett Holloway's business in Dusty Creek was considerably more specific than cattle brokering. He was in the territory looking at land. He was in the territory looking at Jacob Bristol's land. He had apparently approached Jacob 2 years prior about selling the northern section of his range, and Jacob had declined. And Holloway had come back with more money, and Jacob had declined again. And now Holloway was back with what appeared to be a different strategy. She heard this from Tom Birch, one of Jacob's ranch hands, who came into the general store one afternoon looking bothered, and told his version of events to the storekeeper with the freedom of a man who did not know the schoolteacher was on the other side of a shelf examining dry goods. What she heard made her hands go still on a bolt of muslin. Holloway was not just offering money. He was pressing claims, old land disputes, questions about the original title, the kind of legal pressure that cost more to fight than the land was worth to most people. He had a lawyer with him, apparently, one of the 3 associates, and they had been filing things with the Territorial Land Office. He was also, according to Tom Birch, telling people in town things about Jacob that were untrue, things about where Jacob had come from, about what he had done during the war, casting shadows on a reputation already kept thin by years of rumor. Wilhelmina finished her shopping and walked to the telegraph office and sent a letter to a former acquaintance in Kansas City who had studied law, asking a particular set of questions about territorial land titles and what could and could not be challenged after 6 years of continuous use and improvement. She did not tell Jacob she had done this. She did not know yet what use it would be, or whether she had any standing to act at all. But she was not by nature a person who could see something wrong being done and simply wait. She saw Jacob 2 days later when he came in to file a response with the land office, which occupied a small room at the back of the territorial court building. He came out of that building with the controlled stillness of a man making a significant effort not to show how hard something is, and she was coming out of the post office across the street and their eyes met, and she crossed without thinking particularly hard about whether she should. "How bad is it?" she asked, because with him she had learned quickly that the most direct question was always the kindest. He looked at her for a moment. "Had enough," he said. "The lawyer they have is good. The claim is thin, but it does not need to be thick to cost me more to fight than I have." She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "I have asked someone to look into the nature of the claim," she said. "A person I know from Kansas City with legal training. I hope you do not mind." The quality of surprise in his face was real and unguarded. She saw it plainly before he had a chance to manage it. "You did that," he said. "I did," she said. "It is probably nothing useful, but I thought it was worth asking." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had stepped somewhere she should not have. But when he spoke, his voice had that unlocked quality again, the door that had been opening inch by inch since that first morning. "Why?" he asked, and the question was not suspicious, only genuine, the question of a man who genuinely did not understand why someone would do a thing like that for him. She looked at him steadily. "Because I believe what I see," she said, "and I have been watching you for 6 weeks now." Something in his face changed in a way she did not have precise words for. It was like watching a window be cleared, everything behind it suddenly more visible, more real. He looked at her as though she had said something he had stopped believing anyone would say. "Wilhelmina," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it in the full length of her spine. "Jacob," she said back, meeting his eyes. He took a breath. Then he said quietly, "I should very much like to show you those aspen trees." She smiled at him, and it was the kind of smile she did not use for anything polite or social, the kind that came from somewhere lower and more honest than politeness. "I would like that very much," she said. The letter came from Kansas City at the end of the week, and it contained exactly the piece of information she had been hoping for. Territorial land titles established through the Homestead Act of 1862, and subsequently improved upon and maintained for a continuous period of 5 or more years, were extraordinarily difficult to challenge on the basis of original title disputes without proof of prior filing. And the land Holloway's lawyer was claiming a prior interest in had in fact been surveyed and assigned with clean documentation in 1872, before Jacob had taken possession in 1873. The so-called prior claim was paper-thin, based on a conflation of survey markers that a competent examination would disprove. She walked out to Jacob's ranch herself to tell him, because the information was time-sensitive, and he was not expected in town for another 3 days, and she was not a patient woman when something important needed doing. She borrowed the dun mare that Mrs. Aldridge kept behind the house and rode the 4 miles in the late afternoon light. And the country between the town and the ranch was beautiful in the way that country is beautiful when it is still mostly itself. The land wide and the sky enormous, the mountains to the west going purple in the coming evening, the sage smell heavy and good in the warm air. The ranch was clean and well organized, which told her things she had already mostly known. The main house was modest but solid, built from pine and stone, with a covered porch along the front that had 2 plain chairs on it. She could see the hay barn further back, and a corral where several horses moved with the easeful quality of animals well kept and unfrightened. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Charlie, saw her coming and went to fetch Jacob, and she dismounted and waited with the letter in her hand, and Jacob came out of the barn with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and sawdust on his shirt, and when he saw her face he read it correctly. "Good news," he said. "I believe so," she said, and handed him the letter. He read it standing there in the yard, and she watched his face as he read, and what she saw was not the relief she expected, but something more complicated, something that moved in his eyes and in the set of his jaw, and that she understood after a moment was a person being unused to good things arriving. He had been prepared very thoroughly for the bad outcome. The good one was taking a moment to become real. This would hold up. He asked, still looking at the letter. "The person who wrote that has been practicing land law for 4 years, she said. His exact words were that the claim was built on sand. Jacob looked up at her then. The evening light was behind her, and he had to shade his eyes, which gave him a quality of looking at her very directly and without any of his usual guard. "You did this," he said. "You went and did this." "I wrote a letter," she said, not entirely accurately. "Wilhelmina." He said her name like it was something he was holding carefully. "Do you understand what this means? They have been trying to force a settlement. If I can fight back, you can fight back," she said. He looked at her for a long, full moment. With the evening coming down around them and the horses moving quietly in the corral, and the mountains going from purple to indigo, and she had the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and very right. He stepped toward her. He was still holding the letter, and he stopped close enough that she could see the specific gold in his dark eyes that she had noticed before and thought about afterward. He reached out slowly and took her hand where it hung at her side, and held it in both of his with a deliberateness that was nothing like impulsivity. It was a man who had thought about something and made a decision. "I have been trying to find the right words for some time now," he said, with an honesty so plain it nearly undid her. "You are not required to find all of them at once," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, "because I think you deserve that, and I think you are someone who would prefer it." "I would," she confirmed. "I have not felt this way about a person in a very long time," he said. "And I have been careful about it because I have learned that caring for someone, and then losing them, is the most expensive thing a person can undertake. But I believe," he stopped, and something moved in his face, and he began again. "I believe that being careful can become its own kind of mistake. I believe you are someone worth being willing to risk the expensive thing for." She turned her hand over in his and held it properly, palm to palm. "I have spent 6 weeks paying attention," she said, "and I have arrived at the same conclusion from the other direction." He looked at her, and that window in him that had been clearing inch by inch for weeks was now fully open, and what she saw through it was a man who was, she found the word and kept it carefully, good. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, not without his own years of scar and weight and grief, but fundamentally, irrevocably good in the way that the best things are good, not because nothing had ever tried to make them otherwise, but because something in them had held. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, which was formal and old-fashioned and entirely correct, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere in her chest like a lit lamp. "There are aspen trees," he said against her hand. She laughed softly, which she had not expected. "Take me to see them," she said. He did not take her that evening. It was too late and too far, but he walked with her along the edge of the property toward the creek, through the last of the day's light, and she learned the shape of his land from the inside, the way he could name every change in the terrain, every particular quality of the soil, the way the creek ran, where the good grass was. He knew this land the way she knew the inside of a good book, by heart and with complete attention, and it made her understand something about how a person can love a place the way they love another person, with the full comprehension that it could be taken, and the choice to love it anyway. They stood at the edge of the creek as the last light left the sky and the first stars appeared, and he stood close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away. "I should ride back before it is full dark," she said. "Yes," he agreed without moving. She looked at him in the dusk, the strong line of his profile against the darkening sky. "Jacob." "Yes. I am not afraid of the women's opinion," she said. "I want to be clear about that." He turned to look at her and smiled, not the contained, careful thing she had seen pieces of before, but a real, full smile, and it was so entirely unexpected and so completely beautiful that she felt the last of her careful reserve dissolve entirely. "I know you are not," he said warmly. "That was apparent from the first morning." She rode back through the night with the stars enormous overhead and the sage-scented air cool on her face, and she felt something she had not felt in years, the particular lightness of a person who has been carrying a weight they had gotten so used to that they stopped noticing it, and has set it down. Garrett Holloway's response to the legal counterargument was not graceful. He was a man accustomed to pressure working, and pressure not working made him show aspects of himself that his surface charm usually concealed. He showed up at the land office with his lawyer and his loud voice, and made a scene that the clerk described to the entire town by midday, and the town's opinion of Holloway shifted measurably. Sheriff Aldridge, who was not the most perceptive man Wilhelmina had ever met but was thorough, looked into Holloway's background and found enough to be interesting, including a land dispute in New Mexico territory 2 years prior that had ended with accusations of document fraud that had never quite been proven. He told Holloway, quietly but very clearly, that Dusty Creek had no need of his particular brand of business, and that he would be well served to conclude his affairs and move along. Holloway moved along within the week. The land claim was withdrawn. Jacob's title was uncontested. The night before Holloway left, he stopped Wilhelmina on the street and said something that was meant to be threatening in a thin, plausible way, something about the quality of her judgment in choosing her associations, something about how a schoolteacher's reputation was a fragile thing. She looked at him with the same steady eyes she used on the children who tested her in the classroom and said, "My judgment is my own business, Mr. Holloway, and I find it to be sound. I wish you safe travels." Then she walked away and did not look back, and she was shaking slightly by the time she reached her door, but not with fear, with anger, which was a cleaner and more useful emotion. She told Jacob about it the following day because she was not going to keep things from him, and his response was quiet and controlled, but his jaw did the thing it did when he was working hard to stay still, and he looked at her with an expression of combined relief that she was unhurt and something else that she chose not to press. "He is gone," she said firmly. "It is done." "Yes," he said, working it down. "It is done." A pause. "You handled that alone." "It did not require assistance," she said. Words on a street are only words. He looked at her with that quality again, that particular attention she had learned to read as the highest expression of his regard. "You are remarkable," he said quietly, and it was entirely without performance, just a plain statement of what he thought, and it hit her harder than any ornate declaration could have. They had Sunday dinner together for the first time the following week, not at the Lucky Bell, but at the home of Miguel Reyes and his wife Elena, who had invited them both and who had laid a table that was an event in itself, with food that made Wilhelmina close her eyes in appreciation and a warmth of welcome that made her feel immediately, entirely at ease. Thomas Reyes, the boy from the schoolyard, sat across the table and was cautiously friendly, studying Jacob with the careful attention of a child taking the measure of an adult. At one point during the meal, Thomas said to Jacob, quite directly, "My papa says you are a good man." Jacob looked at Miguel, who was looking at his chicken with a slight smile. "Your papa is very kind," Jacob said. "He does not say it about many people," Thomas said, with the devastating honesty of an 8-year-old. "Then I am very honored," Jacob said, and he meant it, and Thomas decided on the basis of this exchange that Jacob was acceptable, and thereafter spent the remainder of the meal showing Jacob a carved horse he had made, which Jacob examined with complete seriousness and several questions about the technique. Wilhelmina watched this across the table and felt something move and settle in her chest that she finally gave its proper name, quietly and privately, on the way home in the warm evening. Love. There it was, straightforward as the man himself. She did not say it immediately, because they were still in the early, precious weeks of something being built, and she was not reckless. But she held it with the same care that Jacob had used when he held her hand, deliberately, knowing exactly what she was holding. The summer came on with the full force of a Colorado summer, long days, afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in from the mountains with a dramatics that never stopped being extraordinary, the smell of lightning and wet sage, the evenings cool and clear and full of stars. Jacob took her to see the Aspen Grove on a Saturday in early June, riding out in the morning with a packed saddlebag that turned out to contain lunch, because he had thought of everything without making anything of it. The aspens were not yet gold, that was autumn's gift, but they were beautiful in their summer way, the leaves turning with every breath of air, the underside silver, the whole grove in constant gentle motion. They sat among them on a blanket with bread and cheese and cold coffee from a jar, and talked for 3 hours without noticing the time, which was the best kind of conversation, the kind where the content matters and so does the silence between it, and both people are exactly where they want to be. He told her more about Virginia, about the farm his father had kept before the war, about brothers, 2 of them, both older. Neither survived the fighting, both buried somewhere in Virginia in unmarked ground he had never been able to find. She sat with that for a moment, the full weight of it. 2 brothers and a farm and a whole world, gone in 4 years, and then Colorado and the slow, hard business of building again. "I wonder sometimes if I came far enough west," he said, not quite to her, more to the aspens and the open sky above them. "If there is a distance that makes the loss smaller, I have not found the distance yet. I do not think distance is what does it," she said carefully. "I think it is time, and it is what you build, and you have built something real." She paused. "Your brothers would recognize what you have done here. I think they would feel it was worthy of them." He was quiet for a long time, looking up through the aspens. Then he said, "I think you may be the most honest person I have ever known." "I try to be," she said. "It seems like the most useful way to be." He turned his head to look at her, close in the afternoon shade of the aspens, and she met his eyes, and the quality of the moment shifted into something that neither of them was pretending not to feel. He reached up and tucked back a piece of her hair that had come loose from its pin, with a gentleness that was not tentative but entirely sure of itself, and his hand came to rest along her jaw. "May I?" he asked, which was so characteristic of him, this exact combination of directness and restraint, that she felt her heart turn over cleanly. "Yes," she said. He kissed her with the same quality that defined everything else about him, completely present, completely honest, nothing withheld and nothing performed. It was the best kind of first kiss, not dramatic, not uncertain but deeply, straightforwardly real. When they separated, the aspens were still moving in the breeze, and the afternoon was still golden, and absolutely nothing about the world had changed, except that something had been decided that was not going to be undecided. "I have been thinking," he said after a moment. About what? She asked, though she had an idea. About the autumn, he said. About whether a person might consider after appropriate time. He stopped, started again. I am not practiced at this, Wilhelmina. I want to do it correctly. You are doing it correctly, she said. Continue. He took a breath. I would like to ask when the time is right, when we have known each other long enough that the question is not reckless, whether you might be willing to consider making a life here. A shared one. This ranch, this country. With me. She looked at him in the aspen-filtered light and thought about Kansas City and the debt and the starting over and the stagecoach that had brought her to Dusty Creek. And she thought about 22 children in a classroom and Thomas Ray's and Miguel Reyes's dinner table and the women who had warned her and the man they had all been wrong about. When the time is right, she said, I believe my answer will be yes. Something opened up in his face, not surprise this time, but a deep, clean relief, like a man who has been bracing against a cold wind and the wind has finally turned warm. He took her hand and held it, and they sat together among the aspens for another hour while the afternoon aged into evening, and it was perfect in the way that things rarely are completely, unself-consciously, genuinely perfect. The summer continued its generous course. They were in each other's company regularly enough that it ceased to be remarkable to anyone, except the people who had something invested in the old story of Jacob Bristol, the dangerous man, and even Eugenia Hartwell, formidable Eugenia, who had issued the first warning at the stagecoach depot, softened by gradual degrees as the weeks went on. She came to Wilhelmina one afternoon in July, arriving at the schoolhouse where Wilhelmina was preparing materials for the fall term with the directness of a woman who has decided to say something she has been sitting with for some time. I have been watching Mr. Bristol, Eugenia said, without preamble, over these past months. More carefully than before. And, Wilhelmina said without looking up from the papers she was sorting. Eugenia was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. I believe I may have been incomplete in my assessment, she said, which was, Wilhelmina suspected, as close to an apology as Eugenia Hartwell had come in 20 years. Wilhelmina looked up then, and her expression was warm and not at all triumphant. People are more than their reputation, Mrs. Hartwell, she said. I think you know that. Eugenia pressed her lips together in a way that might have been acknowledgement. He fixed the widow Carey's porch last week, she said. Without being asked and without saying anything to anyone about it. That sounds like him, Wilhelmina said. Clara Beaumont was spreading stories about him that were not entirely fair to him, Eugenia said. I may have been too willing to repeat them without examining them closely. He holds no grudge about any of it, Wilhelmina said. I can tell you that for certain. Eugenia nodded once sharply, as though filing this information under a corrected heading. He seems to make you happy, she said then in a different voice, softer and more genuine. He does, Wilhelmina said simply. Then that is what matters, Eugenia said, and left with the same authority with which she had arrived. And Wilhelmina sat for a moment with the quiet satisfaction of a thing being set right, slowly and imperfectly but genuinely, the way most right things are set. In August, there was a bad week. Not catastrophically bad, but the kind of week that tests the truth of things. Jacob's hay barn suffered a partial fire from a lantern accident. No one was hurt, but nearly a third of his summer hay was lost, which at the start of August with winter coming was a serious blow. He rode into town 2 days after it happened to purchase what he could and arrange for additional delivery from a farm to the south. And he looked exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical, the kind of tired that comes from setback, arriving when you least have the resources for it. She met him at the general store and they walked together to the end of the street where there was a bench under the overhang of the old mercantile and sat down, and she let him talk through the practicalities of it, the cost, the logistics, the timeline, what it meant for the winter planning. She listened without trying to solve it for him, understanding that what he needed right now was not solutions but the chance to say the problem out loud to someone who would simply receive it. When he had finished, she said, "What can I do?" He looked at her with tired eyes. "You are already doing it," he said. She took his hand. They sat for a while. It was a warm evening with the last light very gold on the mountains. He leaned his head back against the post and closed his eyes, and she watched the exhaustion in his face and thought about how she loved him, precisely this, in fact, the ordinary difficulty of it, the shared weight of a hard week, as much as she loved the aspens and the evening and the open sky. When he opened his eyes, he looked at her with his full attention. "I talked to Reverend Collins," he said. She waited. "I asked him about the process," he said, "for conducting a wedding, what the requirements were. The time needed. Her heart was doing something very considerable in her chest. And what did he say?" she asked. "He said if a man had made up his mind and the lady in question had made up hers, it was a matter of a few weeks and no more than that." He paused. "I know I said I would wait until the time was right. I believe this is right. I believe—" He stopped and took a breath and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was entirely unguarded, entirely his, not a single piece of it held back. "I believe I would like to stop arriving at your door and leaving again. I believe I would like you to be home." It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her, and she was crying before she quite knew it was happening, which was embarrassing, and she did not care at all. "Yes," she said. "Jacob, yes." The answer was always going to be yes. He cupped her face in both his hands, as gently as anything she had ever been handled, and the evening held them there on the bench under the old mercantile overhang, while the gold went off the mountains and the first stars appeared, and Dusty Creek went about its ordinary evening business around them, and none of it was less than extraordinary. They were married on the 14th of September, 1878, in the small whitewashed church at the end of the main street of Dusty Creek, on a morning when the air was just beginning to carry the first edge of autumn, and the sky was the particular brilliant blue of early fall in the Colorado Territory. Wilhelmina wore the best dress she had been carefully not wearing since she arrived, a cream muslin with small buttons that had belonged to her mother, and she had prairie flowers in her hair because there were prairie flowers and she liked them, and that was reason enough. She walked herself up the aisle because there was no one to give her away, and she did it with her head up and her eyes straight ahead, and when she saw Jacob at the end of the aisle, her breath left her body entirely for one moment because he was looking at her with an expression that contained everything he had ever carefully not said. All at once, clear as river water, the whole town came. Even the people who had spent months saying things about Jacob Bristol that were not true. Even Eugenia Hartwell, who sat in the second pew and cried from the very beginning with the particular intensity of a woman making amends through emotion. Even Clara Beaumont, who was gracious enough to actually seem happy for them, which Wilhelmina appreciated. Miguel and Elena Reyes sat near the front, and Thomas Reyes had dressed up in a stiff collar and was enormously serious about the whole proceedings. Jacob's 3 ranch hands were in the front row on the groom's side, wearing their cleanest clothes and looking proud in the way that people do when something good is happening to someone they respect. Reverend Collins read them the words that people have been reading in different forms for longer than anyone can trace, and they said what they meant to say to each other and meant every syllable. And when it was done and Jacob kissed her with the whole town watching, he did not make it brief, and she did not expect him to. Francis Dumont provided the wedding meal at the Lucky Bell, and it was an occasion of considerable warmth and noise, and several people made speeches of varying quality, and Tom Birch played a fiddle with surprising competence, and Wilhelmina danced with her husband in the middle of the Lucky Bell's cleared floor, while the afternoon sun came through the windows and fell across the boards, and she thought, very clearly and without any qualification, that she was entirely and completely happy. They went home that evening to the ranch, to the house Jacob had built, and the stars were extraordinary over the open land, and the creek was running quiet and clear in the dark, and she stood on the porch with her husband's arms around her and looked at the sky and felt the particular, irreplaceable wholeness of being exactly where you are supposed to be. The autumn came fully into itself over the following weeks with the generosity that Jacob had promised. The aspens went gold, not just the grove by the creek but the whole country, every hillside and draw, the mountains themselves layered with it against the deep evergreen and the enormous sky. She had come from Kansas City and from grief, and from a kind of smallness that she had not entirely known was smallness, until she stood in the middle of this country with her husband beside her, and felt the scale of the world open up in all directions. She continued teaching through the fall, because the children needed her, and because she would have gone quietly mad without her work, and Jacob understood this completely. He drove her to school most mornings and picked her up in the evenings when he was close enough to do so. And there was an undemonstrative practical tenderness in this arrangement that she loved more than she would have known to ask for. He was not a man who said "I love you" lightly or often, but when he said it she never had the slightest doubt of what it meant, and between the sayings there was the daily evidence of it. The firewood that appeared before she knew the supply was low, the coffee ready before she was awake, the way he listened to her talk through a problem with the children as though the problem were genuinely important, which to her it was, and he knew that. Thomas Ray's improved dramatically at reading over the fall term, and Wilhelmina went to dinner at the Ray's house again to tell his parents, and Thomas showed Jacob a new carved horse, considerably more sophisticated than the first, and Jacob bought it from him for 2 bits, which Thomas accepted with great dignity, and then spent looking for something to be casual about because he was too pleased to stand still. By winter, she was expecting their first child. She told Jacob on a quiet evening in December, with snow coming down outside and the stove lit, and the house warm and small and complete around them. He went absolutely still for a moment, in the way he went still when something significant happened, gathering it in, making it real. Then he stood up from the table and came around it and pulled her up out of her chair and held her for a long time, not saying anything, and she could feel his heart moving against her. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "And it is the best kind of frightened, the kind that means something real is happening." She laughed into his shoulder. "That is exactly what it is," she said. The winter was hard, as winters in the Colorado Territory were, but the hay situation that had seemed dire in August had been resolved through a combination of careful management and the delivery from the southern farm, and the cattle came through in better shape than Jacob had feared. Wilhelmina spent the long evenings reading, writing letters, planning the following school year, and watching her husband work at the table with his account books and his plans, and thinking about how ordinary, extraordinary things become when they are constant. She thought sometimes about the women who had warned her. She did not think about them with any bitterness. They had spoken from their own experience of a world that had taught them, often very thoroughly, that an unknown man was likely dangerous, that charm and reputation were the available evidence. That caution was wisdom. They had not been malicious, most of them, only limited by information. It was hard to blame a person for that. She hoped that what they saw now, Jacob Bristol fixing Widow Carey's porch and paying Thomas Ray's 2 bits for a carved horse, and working his land honestly and loving his wife without reservation, would expand the evidence available to them for the next judgment they were called to make. She thought this was perhaps the most useful thing a life could do, not to prove anyone wrong exactly, but to add to the world's supply of available evidence about what a person could be. Spring arrived with the usual extravagant Colorado announcement, snowmelt and mud, and the first tentative green coming up through the brown grass, and the aspens putting out their first small pale leaves, and the creek running high and cold and bright with the snowmelt. She was large with the child by March, and she had modified her dress, and she taught school from her chair more often than she stood, and the children were solicitous in the endearing, slightly overbearing way of children who have decided an adult needs looking after. Thomas Ray's, now 9 and remarkably self-possessed for his age, appointed himself the official carrier of anything heavy that needed carrying in the classroom, and performed this duty with a gravity that made Wilhelmina want to cry with affection. The baby was born on the 19th of April, 1879, a boy, arriving in the early morning hours with Dr. Oakes in attendance and Alina Reyes present because Alina had said firmly that Wilhelmina should not be without a woman she knew nearby, and she had been right about that. Jacob was outside with his hands in the way that men were kept outside in those times, and when Dr. Oakes opened the door and told him he had a son, Wilhelmina heard him through the wall, the single quiet sound he made, and she held her son and thought that the world had, rather completely and definitively, exceeded anything she had dared to want from it. They named him Samuel after Jacob's oldest brother, and the naming was something that happened in the morning after the birth, in the quiet of the bedroom with the early sun coming through the window, with Wilhelmina sitting up against the pillows and Jacob in the chair pulled close, and the baby between them on the blanket with his remarkable newborn face turned to the light. "Samuel," Jacob said softly, trying it. He put one finger against the baby's closed fist, and Samuel's fingers curled around it with the reflex of new life, and Jacob's expression was the most completely open she had ever seen it, stripped down to its foundations, entirely unguarded, an expression she knew she would carry in her memory as long as she lived. "He looks like you," she said. "He is considerably smaller," Jacob said, which made her laugh and then wince, and he was immediately attentive in the way he always was when she needed care. All his practicality turned to her service. Samuel Bristol grew from a baby into a small person with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined jaw, and he was an energetic and cheerful child who had an early and passionate interest in horses that delighted Jacob beyond all reasonable proportion. By the time Samuel was 2, he could name every horse on the ranch. By the time he was 3, Jacob had him up in front of the saddle on his first short rides around the corral, and the expression on Samuel's face during these rides was one of the purely transported joys that only small children and certain kinds of music can produce. Wilhelmina taught school for 2 years after Samuel's birth, until the fall of 1881, when she stepped back to manage the household through the particular fullness of that season. Samuel was running everywhere and into everything, and she was expecting their second child, and there was more work on the ranch than Jacob could handle with only 3 men, and they had hired a 4th, and she was managing the household accounts, which had grown complicated in the way that successful things become complicated. She did not stop reading or stop having opinions or stop being deeply herself in any particular, which Jacob had never had the slightest interest in her doing. He had married exactly who she was, and he continued to behave accordingly. Their second child was a daughter, born in January of 1882, whom they named Clara after no one in particular, but because the name suited the particular quality of the baby's face, wide-eyed and grave and watchful. Clara Bristol was born in the coldest part of the winter, and seemed, from the very beginning, to take the world quite seriously, which made sense given the season of her arrival. Samuel was 3, and treated his new sister with a mixture of proprietary pride and bafflement that was familiar to any observer of older siblings everywhere. Jacob and Wilhelmina sat on the porch of the ranch house on a spring evening when Clara was 3 months old, with Samuel asleep inside, and Clara in Wilhelmina's arms taking her time about going to sleep herself, and the mountains were very clear in the evening air, and the creek sound came up from the northwest corner of the property, and the aspens were just beginning their spring green. "Do you know what I have been thinking about?" Wilhelmina said. Jacob looked at her sideways with the slight warmth in his eyes that was his version of open affection. "Tell me." "I have been thinking about the stagecoach," she said, "about arriving with that battered trunk. About how Eugenia Hartwell grabbed my elbow before I was properly off the platform, and warned you to cross the street if you saw me," he said, without any bitterness, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact. Yes, she said, and I have been thinking if I had listened, if I had simply accepted what I was told and never paid attention to what I actually saw. She paused, looking at Clara's small, serious, sleeping face. We would not have this, she said simply. Any of this. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him taking it in the way he did, fully, with all of himself. Then he said, I had about given up on the idea of this, of any of it. She looked at him. Of what specifically? Of being known, he said simply and quietly. Actually known, not the story, not the reputation, me. He looked out at the mountains. I had started to believe the story was all there was going to be, that a man could be completely covered over by other people's words until there was nothing left that could be seen. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He put his own hand over it. I saw you, she said. You did, he said. From the very beginning you did. They sat in the warm evening with their daughter asleep between them and the mountains going rose gold in the setting sun, and the whole ranch spread out below the porch. Everything they had built together, real and solid and theirs. And the sound of the creek came up in the quiet, and the first stars were appearing. And Jacob Bristol put his arm around his wife, and she leaned into him in the way that people lean into something they know is steady and strong and built to last. And the evening settled around them with the fullness of all the things that were complete. Eugenia Hartwell stopped Wilhelmina at the post office the following week, as she had a habit of doing, and asked after Samuel and the baby with genuine warmth. Then she paused, which was unusual for Eugenia, who did not pause often. I said some things to you when you arrived, she said, about Mr. Bristol. I want you to know I am aware that I was wrong. You were careful on my behalf, Wilhelmina said kindly. That is not a bad impulse. It is a bad impulse when the carefulness is built on incomplete information, Eugenia said, with her characteristic bluntness, which Wilhelmina had come to appreciate. I should have looked more carefully before I spoke so definitively. You understood that from the beginning. I did not. You understand it now, Wilhelmina said. That is what matters. Eugenia gave her a look that was both gratitude and acknowledgement in equal measure. He is a good man, she said firmly, as though recording it for the official record. A genuinely good man. He is, Wilhelmina agreed. He always was. Eugenia nodded once sharply with finality, and the matter was closed. She handed over Wilhelmina's mail, and they discussed the weather and the coming summer and Samuel's interest in horses. And it was the most comfortable conversation Wilhelmina had ever had with her, which meant something had been set right between them that was worth setting right. The years in Dusty Creek moved forward with the accumulating richness of years that are lived fully. Jacob's ranch grew from a working operation into something genuinely notable in the territory. The horses he had begun breeding proved to be exceptional. A cross of stock that produced animals with the endurance and temperament that the territory's expanding economy demanded. And there was a waiting list for his foals by 1883 that made the early years of scarcity feel very distant. He hired 2 more men and built a larger barn, and the northwest pasture that had been rough ground he had planned to improve someday became an actual training paddock for the young horses. Wilhelmina returned to teaching in the fall of 1883, when Clara was old enough for Alina Reyes to look after during school hours, because the town needed its school teacher and she needed her work, and both these things were true and not in conflict. She taught with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and when she came home in the evenings, she came home to a house that had grown in small ways over the years. A second room added on the east side, a proper kitchen instead of the original corner stove, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides now, and to her husband who still had coffee ready and who still listened to the day's problems with complete attention. Thomas Reyes had grown into a young man of 15 by 1884, serious and capable, and still devoted to horses in the way that certain people are called to a particular vocation from childhood and never waver from it. Jacob had offered him part-time work at the ranch 2 years prior, and Thomas had accepted with the dignity and seriousness he brought to all things, and he was becoming, under Jacob's instruction, a genuinely skilled horseman. Miguel Reyes came to the ranch one fall afternoon to speak to Jacob privately, and afterward Jacob told Wilhelmina that Miguel had thanked him, in the particular and formal way of a man who means something very deeply, for what he had done for his son. "I told him Thomas had done it for himself," Jacob said. "I just gave him a place to do it." "You gave him something else too," Wilhelmina said. Jacob looked at her. "Someone who saw his worth without qualification," she said. "Someone who did not look at him and see anything other than a capable young person worth investing in." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I know what it is," he said finally, "to be seen incorrectly by the world. I have some interest in making sure I do not do that to anyone else." She thought that this was perhaps the most complete expression of who he was that she had ever heard him give, and she held it in her heart with everything else she held there. The aspens and the creek and Samuel's horse obsession and Clara's grave, watchful eyes and the feel of his hands, and the sound of his voice saying her name in the dark, all of it together in the particular, private treasury of a life that is well loved and fully lived. On an evening in October of 1884, they walked together to the aspen grove by the creek, just the two of them. Samuel and Clara left with Alina for the evening, and the aspens were at the full height of their autumn color, not just gold but every shade that gold can be, amber and butter, and the deep warm brown of turning leaves, every tree a different version of the same burning, the whole grove lit from within by the low angle of the October sun. They stood in the middle of it, and the leaves turned and turned overhead in the slow, steady wind, and she thought of the first time he had described this place to her on the schoolhouse steps, with a cup of coffee getting cold in his hand. 6 years ago now. A young man being careful about what he wanted because wanting had cost him so much before. She took his hand and he looked at her in the gold light, and he was not young anymore in the way he had been young at 28. But what age had done to him was add depth to everything that had been there before, the steadiness, the honesty, the quality of attention that made her feel, every time, as though she were the most important thing currently happening in the world. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time you described this place to me?" "I remember everything from those first weeks," he said. "I was paying very close attention," she smiled. "What were you paying attention to?" He turned to look at her fully, and the aspens moved around them in a slow gold rush, and the creek ran below the hill, and the mountains were visible through the trees going from gold to red in the late sun. "Everything," he said. "The way you held your ground, the way you listened, the way you made up your own mind about things, the way you were never afraid of the whole truth of a situation." He paused. "The way you looked at me," he said quietly, "like you were seeing what was actually there." She reached up and put her hand along his face the way he had done to her in this same grove 6 years ago, with the same deliberateness, the same complete intention. "I have always seen what was actually there," she said. He turned his face into her hand. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I love you, Wilhelmina," and it was the plainest and most complete version of those words she had ever heard in her life. "I love you," she said back. "I have loved you for a very long time." He put his arms around her in the middle of the aspen grove, and the leaves came down around them in slow gold spirals, and the creek ran cold and clear below, and the mountains held the light until the very last of it, and the Colorado sky went from blue to the particular deep luminous indigo of a fall evening, and above the mountains the first stars appeared one by one. There had been a stagecoach and a battered trunk, and every woman in Dusty Creek telling her the same urgent and well-meaning warning. There had been a man on a black horse with dark eyes, and a face that had seen weather, and a reputation that was made entirely of other people's fears and disappointments. There had been primer books in the mud and coffee on a schoolhouse step, and a letter to Kansas City and a walk through the dark to a creek, and dinner at the Lucky Bell and the Ray's family's table, and a November night when he had said the word home and meant her. There had been this, a life, real and complete and theirs. Built from bare ground with honest hands and honest eyes, the same way he had built everything else, the same way she had always done everything, the only way either of them knew how fully, truly, with nothing held back and nothing hidden, every piece of it exactly what it appeared to be. The aspens went on turning in the evening wind, and the creek went on running, and overhead the stars multiplied in the darkening sky until there were too many to count. And in the little town, 4 miles to the east, the lights were coming on in the windows one by one. And in the ranch house that waited for them, Samuel Bristol's toy horses were lined up along the windowsill, and Clara Bristol's crayon drawings were tacked to the wall. And the stove would need to be lit, and there was bread that needed making. And tomorrow the school bell would ring, and the horses would need their morning feed, and the ordinary, extraordinary life would continue exactly as it was earned and true and more than. Enough, more than either of them had known to hope for when they were younger and carrying their weight alone. They walked back through the aspens as the last light left the sky, hand in hand, through the gold-dark grove toward home.